And this, unfortunately, is a problem that would kind of plague fundamentalism, not just fundamentalism. I think it's been a problem throughout the history of the church, but it would become, unfortunately, especially problematic for the fundamentalist movement, especially in the South, but not limited to that. We might talk about that more later. I'm going to say this problem began, at least in the United States, with this feller here named Charles Finney. Now, I had to look it up real quick. He was born in 1792. He died in 1875. So the time we're talking about is like the 1920s and 30s and 40s. So about 75 years prior to the people we're talking about. But it had a significant impact on American Christianity. In fact, I would argue American Christianity has never recovered from Charles Finney. Alyssa was asking what I was working on, and I told her I was going to get to bash Charles Finney today. And she laughed. She's heard my Charles Finney rant a few times. Charles Finney ruined everything. Okay, not really. I'm sure there's always more like cultural, spiritual factors to things. But he was, unfortunately, the figurehead of a movement that really did cause a lot of problems for American Christianity. He was an evangelist. He did a lot of traveling revival meetings. But he had a particular approach to ministry that unfortunately become mainstream. We can ask ourselves, why is it that today our pastor has to do a series on what biblical success is? Like why is it that our culture doesn't know what biblical success is? There are many reasons, but one of them is Charles Finney, who really shifted the way people approached church, the way people approached ministry, the way people approached Christian leadership. So again, what I'm calling the great man approach is this. There is a particular charismatic personality who has a large platform. They either do revival meetings all over the country, or they have a Bible college, or something like that, where they have a big platform. And these great men, all in scare quotes, usually have like near unilateral authority over that platform. Whatever they're in charge of, they are charged across the board. What he says goes. They rely heavily on sensationalist, what I would call specialist preaching. In other words, it's not the sort of preaching that just anyone can do. It has a certain flair to it, a certain, kind of, they're usually very persuasive speakers, very, very powerful speakers, and it's this kind of aura around them, and that is the attraction. Now, one of the qualifications to be a great man is you must produce results. That's your whole bit, is you have to have results. And we can ask ourselves, what kind of results, right? Because, results are fine in themselves if we have the right goals. But the results these people have in mind is not, let's say, fostering more love for God in the people around you. For most, I wouldn't say that because there's always been this problem. But I think many Christians understood for a long time that was the goal of church, that was the goal of ministry, is you help foster deeper and better love for God in the people around you. The problem is that's not visible. It's hard to track that. It's hard to see if you're actually doing it. And if there is a way to see it, you have to kind of pull out the camera and look at years, sometimes decades, maybe generations, to see if you've been successful. Well, that takes a lot of patience, and no one wants to put up with that. And so we have to have more tangible results, things that can be measured, like numbers. How many people did we get in the building? How many people are members of our church? This was the invention of the altar call, actually, is we need some way to gauge results. The great man has to prove he's worth the amount you're paying him, and so he preaches the fiery sermon, and then you can count the number of people that come forward to prove that he did a good job, right? Because we have to measure this somehow. And I'm not saying because of that there's never a place for like an invitational or anything, but it was often used as a way of proving the success of the great man. And because he has to get results, and because there's this pressure to get results, he has to get it at all cost. And you can't just trust the Spirit to do what the Spirit's going to do. You have to result to other things, a lot of manipulation, whether it's like guilt tripping or the very flowery sermon or whatever it is. You have to somehow get people to do a thing. Or pragmatism, so kind of maybe, if that's maybe a tendency on the right, that the tendency on the left would be compromise. We got to somehow do what the people want so they come in and I can prove that I'm a success. All to say, ministry became a technique. It was not about obeying God, doing things that God said to do in His Word, and trusting Him to do whatever He's going to do through that. It was we have to master the technique to make the results happen. That's what happened under the ministry of Charles Finney. And so if you had the capital G, capital M, great man, who has a big platform across the nation, the expectation was then that every local church pastor is expected to be sort of a little great man, someone who does these things on a lesser level in their local church. Just expected to wield that kind of power and produce that kind of results in their local context. And unfortunately, because Charles Finney did get results, and I'm not even saying all those results were bad, like people genuinely were saved under his ministry, and we can praise God for that. But because he got results and because things went well for him, unfortunately, a lot of early fundamentalists did have a lot of respect for Finney and tried to emulate that. And there were multiple negative effects of that. One was the minimizing of ordinary ministry. It's no longer just enough to do church and do the things that God says churches ought to do. We have to have something big and sensational. There was an emphasis on measurable results instead of inward transformation. There's the prioritizing of one specialist man of God over the ministry of all believers. Like the body function that Paul talks about suddenly became kind of obsolete if we just have one guy driving this thing. There was an acceptance of pragmatism. You do what you got to do to get the results, because that's the goal. An emphasizing of the sensational over the normal. All right, we got to do something big and exciting, rather than, again, just doing the things that God has told us to do. And this actually did lead to the hyper-fractioning of the fundamentalist movement. So a lot of people outside of fundamentalism, what they'll try to do is blame separatism itself for all the fracturing. Because it did become, by the time you get to the 50s and 60s, fundamentalism is kind of fractured into all these groups. And a lot of people say, well, see, this is what happens when you're a separatist. You just keep splintering. I'm not saying there was none of that, but most of those fractures were not over doctrine. Sometimes they were, but not really. They were usually over all these big personalities butting into each other. Because what happens when you get 5 of these great men in the same room? Well, the town's not big enough for both of us, right? And you have to have these showdowns. And we'll see some of that in a bit. And so that's what starts to happen, is all these different personalities start to butt heads, and people pick sides, and you have I'm a Paul, I'm Apollos, and these things start to happen. So that was another problem that really plagued fundamentalism. But the kind of thing I want to also throw out there is it doesn't have to be this way. This is not an inherent part of fundamentalism. It's a bug. It's a quirk. And there were people who actively rejected it. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at 2 individuals, one who actively rejected this approach, and the one who embraced it kind of whole on. And we'll see which one worked out better, I guess. See if you can guess. All right. So kind of catching us up with where we were last time, we had talked about the Northern Baptist Convention, which was the main Baptist convention in the North, as you might imagine. They unfortunately had become very affected by liberalism, and at least on a structural level and on the upper levels of the hierarchy, they had embraced liberalism. And so the conservatives at first tried to reform it from within. You remember their big attempt was Des Moines University, and that ended in a riot on 2nd and Euclid. And so when that failed so spectacularly, they decided to break away and form a new convention or a new association called the General Association of Regular Baptist Churches. Their first, or not the first president, he was actually their second president, but he would have a significant impact on the movement, was this fellow here, Robert Ketchum. Now, a few things you have to understand for this kind of the story to make sense is what the nature of a Baptist church is and what the nature of Baptist associations are. And this is a unique characteristic of Baptist churches. So let's say you and I, 3 of us here, we're going to go plant a church, all right? We can't just decide we're a Lutheran church, right? To be a Lutheran church, you have to actually be formally connected to one of the Lutheran synods that descended from the Reformation in the 1500s, because that's part of the definition of being Lutheran. It's not just a set of doctrines, it's also an institution. Same with Presbyterian, certainly true of Catholic, right? You have to be actually in fellowship with the Pope. You can't just say, I'm this. You have to actually be a part of the institution. Baptist, though, if the 3 of us did to say, I'm not in particular 3 of us, but 3 of us decided we're going to plant a Baptist church, we could do that. Because Baptist is a tradition, not an institution. As long as you believe the Baptist doctrines, you're a Baptist church. And that's different than other denominations. And this matters for reasons we'll see here in just a moment. Likewise, broader Baptist associations are fellowships, not memberships. So we are not a member of the Iowa Association of Regular Baptist Churches. We are in fellowship with the Iowa Association of Regular Baptist Churches. The difference is when you're a member of something, so almost by definition, you give up at least a little bit of your autonomy to do so. And it's not all bad in some contexts. If you're a member of a family, that has certain requirements on you, right? You have to do certain things in the family. If you're a member of a church, that also gives requirements to you. But what Baptists believe is there should be no authority between Christ and the local church. And so we do not give up some of our autonomy to the IRBC. We just fellowship with them. Robert Ketchum, he explains this way. He says, any regular Baptist church which no longer wishes to fellowship with a convention or association program can withdraw their fellowship without damaging their reputation as Baptist. He goes on to say, a church may do so, quote, for any reason sufficient to itself, without prejudice either for its evangelical or denominational standing. It does not cease to be a Baptist church simply because it chooses its own Baptist companions. So again, like, say a Lutheran, if you leave a Lutheran synod, you're no longer Lutheran. You have to pick a different name or something. But it's different with Baptists. Baptists can leave and still be Baptist. And here's why this matters. The Northern Baptist Convention was insisting that they were the Baptist denomination in the Northern United States. And if you leave their convention, you're no longer Baptist, right? You're no longer a true church. And what that also means is, oh, by the way, since we are the true Baptist church, and you said you were a Baptist church, now you're leaving, your property is now ours. Because that's how a lot of denominations work. We know some people who were members of a church that left the Episcopal Church, and they lost all their property when they did so. Because we're seeing the same fights play out now. When the Episcopals went woke, a lot of them left, and the Episcopal Church, because their structure, took all their property, and they could do that in their denominational structure. And the NBC tried to insist that they also had those rights, but they do not. There were some really nasty stuff going on. There were churches who would vote to leave the NBC on Sunday. The pastor comes in on Tuesday to study, and he's locked out of his own church because the NBC said, no, this is our property now because you left us. And they had to navigate that. And Ketchum became very good at articulating these issues, both in a theological and actually legal way. He was multiple times he was called to be an expert witness during different property trials. And he kind of helped churches navigate both the legal and theological side of this. So unlike the NBC, Ketchum wanted to limit the authority of the organization he was leading. He did not want the GRBC to become like the Northern Baptist Convention. He wanted a decentralized, debureaucratized, that's a word, fellowship of autonomous local churches. You might say he was the 1930s Baptist Doge. Right? He wanted to kind of like gut all this, drain the swamp, gut all the institutions, and have this very bare bones kind of thing. So in the early years, the GRBC did not even have any employees, any paid employees. It did publish a magazine, the Baptist Bulletin, which still exists, but that was about it. It coordinated missions efforts, but it did not control any of the money, which was a big deal in the NBC. So what was their relationship to the NBC? Early on, the GRBC allowed you to be members of both the GRBC and the NBC if you wanted to be. Because it's hard to just leave a convention. That's a whole process, and they want to give churches times to work through that. And one of the more aggressive moves, the GRBC would actually send pastors back to NBC churches to lead them out, which I thought was I find that amusing somehow. There was a big moment in this whole movement was actually Walnut Street Baptist Church in Waterloo, Iowa. I love the fact that in this part of church history, we know these places. There's actually places we know about. They were, at the time, the largest Baptist church in Iowa. I really doubt they are now, but at the time they were. It still exists. I've actually met the current pastor of the church. And they voted to leave the convention, which was a big deal at the time. So they were a substantial giving block to the NBC and all this. The convention tried to refute their right to leave with all the arguments we just used. No, well, you have to give up your property and all this stuff. Ketchum went there, and point by point, he refuted their 17-page letter on why they could not leave the convention. He went by bit by bit and said, nope, that's all rubbish. So then the church just said, okay, having heard all the arguments, let's retake the vote. Just to make sure we're sure, let's retake the vote to leave the convention. It was a unanimous yes. And so that went forward, and that was a big move in showing other churches that, hey, we can leave the convention and the earth doesn't fall out from under us. It's okay. We can do this. And so that was a big example to other churches. So the years go by here. Ketchum, despite his own protest, was elected to 2 more terms as president. However, he informed the nominated committee that he would not do a 4th term. He says, I'll give you this 3rd one, but you're going to find a different guy at the end of this. And he had reasons for this. I want to quote Ketchum here. He said, I have tremendous fear that by carrying a president over too many years, the association shall get the name of being a one-man affair. The day that the association becomes a one-man affair, my interest is utterly gone in it, even though some folks think that one man was myself. Okay, so contrast that attitude to like the great man approach that we just talked about. Ketchum also said, this is when he's accepting the nomination for his third term president. He says this: "If I thought for one moment that either the nominating committee or this body was naming me to the presidency because they honestly felt that I was the only man that could fill the position, you would have my resignation instantly. There are many who are as worthy and capable as I could ever hope to be. If I thought you were naming me as the president of the association because you think I'm a great man, I would walk off this platform now. I have said, and I've been honestly sincere in saying it, that there are no great men among us. We are all little men with a great God. The moment any one of us in this association feels that he is greater than the rest of his brethren, that moment his services can well be dispensed with." So that was his attitude towards leadership. We are all little men with a great God. So despite his sentiments that way, the GRBC did ask Ketchum to travel and promote the association, and he was actually quite good at this sort of thing. He was a pretty skilled apologist. He'd even mastered some like the legal skills to kind of thwart the convention. He could articulate fundamentalist principles very eloquently and very kind of poignantly. He was actually pretty witty. Because of this, he got the nickname Fighting Bob, which he hated. He was not a man looking for a fight, though. His son recounts multiple times where his dad realized a fight was inevitable. Like there was no way he could avoid this particular conflict. And he would literally cry himself to sleep. Robert Ketchum would. So he really hated fighting, but was actually pretty good at it. Which is an interesting paradox, that the people I think who are qualified to fight should not love it. But because of that, they often fail to do it. And so you need someone who is qualified to fight, who doesn't love fighting, but is actually good at it. And so that's kind of the approach that Robert Ketchum took. Any thoughts, comments on that? Yeah, Austin. Yeah, there's actually two fellows I don't like. I'll get the other guy later. The Finney guy I mentioned, he actually died before Ketchum. So Ketchum is kind of coming in the wake of his impact and having to navigate that sort of influence. Because Finney was quite successful. Like it really was a big moment in American history, good and bad. And a lot of people just try to like duplicate Finney's success. And it didn't work. And so Ketchum self-consciously rejected that approach to leadership. Good. I think Ketchum, to some degree, models the ideal of chivalry, the principle of a medieval knight. Not what medieval knights actually were, but the principle of a medieval knight is someone who hates fighting but is good at it, who's someone who has an equal parts meekness and ferocity. And that's kind of, I think, what Ketchum modeled to some degree. We're in the 30s, generally speaking. So, yep. So the GRBC was founded in the Great Depression. Our little talk here is going to go into like 46. So now we have a different example. So this guy is contemporaneous of Ketchum. So like pretty much the exact same time frame. I think this guy, Jeff Norris, is a little bit older, but they overlap for most of the ministry. Bowder and Delnay, who are two scholars that I leaned on pretty heavily for this study, they say this about Norris. They said, one of the first real religious celebrities, J. Frank Norris, stood in the tradition of Christian showmanship that reached from Charles G. Finney through Billy Sunday. He loved to preach to crowds, and he would go to extraordinary lengths to attract one. At some point during his early ministry, he discovered that people loved to watch a fight. Much of his ministry was characterized by conflict as he picked one fight after another. He was very sensationalist, very much and we still see this. I think of this like with the internet now. People are always like goading one another, to get the fight going because that gets views. And that's kind of human nature. It's always been going on. The internet's just kind of like blowing it into a greater proportion. But this guy figured this out. If I'm in conflict with someone, that actually gets attention and can actually help his efforts. So this guy was a Texan. He was very, very influential on Southern Christianity. He pastored First Baptist Church in Fort Worth, which at the time was the largest church in the country. He also, at the exact same time, pastored Temple Baptist Church in Detroit. Like, well, how is he pastoring two churches, they're not close to each other, one in Texas, one in Michigan at the same time? Well, okay, in fairness, he didn't actually pastor either of them. He preached at both of them. Other people did the actual grunt work of pastoring. But he preached at both these churches. He would literally preach early in the morning in Fort Worth, hop on a train, go to Michigan and preach the evening service in Detroit. I think about now like the multi-church or the multi-site churches where the pastor's on like a big screen and not actually there. If that technology was accessible to Norris, he totally would have done it. But he did what the technology allowed him to do. And this was really the first time it was even possible. So rail travel was just now fast enough to make that barely possible. And to him, it was worth the inconvenience to have that platform, of having two mega churches, one in the north, one in the south. He is arguably the first American megachurch pastor. Justin Taylor is another guy who says this issue. He says, quote, the combined membership of the two churches was roughly 25,000, which allowed Norris to boast, as he often did, that he had more parishioners under his pastoral care than any other preacher in America. He was also a pioneer in radio ministry, which again was a very new thing at the time, and he was one of the first people to utilize that. He had a large newspaper called The Fundamentalist, many subscribers. This guy had a ton of influence during his day. Now, there was an incident in 1926. Norris, remember, his whole bit was picking a fight. He preached a series called Rum and Romantism. This is during the Prohibition, 1926. He was very much against alcohol, also against Roman Catholicism. And he attacked the mayor of Fort Worth, whose name is H.C. Machem, who was a Catholic. He accused him of misappropriating funds to fund bootlegging and the Roman Catholic Church. He had this kind of association between Catholicism and alcoholism and like the underground alcohol rings. Okay, there's a ton of good reasons to reject Catholicism, like a lot of really good ones. The idea the Pope is like running a bootlegging operation is not one of them. Like that's not a great argument against Catholicism. There's way better ones you could use. Yeah, I think they played into it. Yeah, because you have this. Yep, yeah, exactly. They started lumping some stereotypes together and said maybe they just like there's some sort of like shady deal going on here. Yeah. So the tensions are rising up. So he preaches this sermon. There's lots of conflict between him and the local government. A fellow named Dexter Elliott Chips, he was a local businessman, lumberjack, I believe. He was a Roman Catholic and a friend of the mayor, Machem. So as tension between Norris and the mayor increase, Chips calls Norris, and they exchange tense words over the phone. Then Chips comes to his office, more heated words, more intense conversation, and Chips at one point challenges him to a fight. But then Chips, he turns to leave. He walks out the door. This is in Norris's office. Norris is seated at his desk. Chips has been standing there yelling at him. Chips turns to leave, gets to the door, stops, puts his hand in his pocket, and said, let's do this, and turns. Okay, that's the situation. I'm tempted to ask what you would do in that situation. What would you do in that situation? Okay, that's a good answer. What would you do in the situation? that would also be a legitimate thought. Yeah, exactly. That could have been all he was saying. What Norris did instead was he pulled the watchman's revolver out of the desk drawer, fired 4 shots, 3 of which hit Chip, and he died. Norris calls his wife and then the police and says, I just killed a man. This attracts all sorts of media attention. Some people have said it was the O.J. Simpson trial of the 1920s. A lot of media attention. This is Texas, okay? So the jury acquits Norris on the grounds of self-defense. I'll just let the one read. You be the judge on whether or not that was the correct verdict or not. Okay, so this is another little side plot. Norris claims, because remember, he's in conflict with city officials. Norris claims that Chips did have a weapon in his pocket, but that the police hid it. The defense did produce a weapon, which they said was the weapon. This is before ballistics and all that, so that there's no way they could have gotten that at the pawn shop. We don't know. So Norris claims, yes, he had a gun in his pocket. The prosecution claims, no, he did not. And Norris claims there's some conspiracy to hide the weapon and all that. But, yeah, who knows? Neither one would shock me. Based on Norris's character, it wouldn't shock me if he just made that up either. Anyway, though, he was acquitted, And Norris, because he was pretty good at this sort of thing, he managed to leverage all the attention to actually increase the size of his church. He had more parishioners the day after he was acquitted than he did prior to that. So, I mean, we could try that. I said, no, do not do that. That's not how you do that. But for him, it worked. Okay, so why are we mentioning Ketchum and Norris? Well, these two stories are actually going to start weaving in here. Norris, if you remember, the Bible Baptist Union was the institution that became the GRBC. Norris was on the board of the Bible Baptist Union, and early on he was associated with the GRBC. He spoke at some of their early conventions. His church was never formally a member. So that's something we also got to establish here, just so we understand this a little bit. The GRBC operates under a messenger system. So you notice I'm saying the GRBC and not GARB. A lot of people say GARB. It should not be called GARB because the C is important. The GRBC is not a fellowship of Baptist individuals. It's a fellowship of Baptist churches. There's a place for fellowships of individuals, but that's not what this is. And that's important. So how it's governed is messengers are sent by the churches to the convention or to the association, and they make decisions for the association. No one's allowed just to appoint themselves a messenger, though, because no individual is a member. The church is a member, or is no member. No, gotta say it right because all these terms matter. No individual is a member. The church is in fellowship with the association. Okay. No one, even the pastor, can just appoint themselves to be a messenger. I just can't say I'm a messenger and therefore I get a vote at this convention. The church has to appoint people to be messengers, and they could appoint anyone in the church. And so how do we verify this? Well, the system the GRBC came up with is you have to show a copy of your church's minutes saying you were appointed to be a messenger at this association. Okay, so that's the system. That's how the GRBC is run. Norris attempted to come to a convention without proper credentials. This may have been an oversight. It may have been a deliberate attempt to forge credentials. And this is my leaning. What seems like happened is, because of the way Norris viewed church government, he's the boss, and so he just appointed himself as a messenger. And when he got there, the secretaries, the people who verify these things, you can't, you don't have the credentials. Those are the rules. Well, they then call up, Fort Worth and say, hey, send copies of the minutes, wink, winks. And they get 2 different copies that don't match, which seems suspect, okay? So because of all this, because he didn't have proper credentials, he was not allowed to vote at this convention, because that's the rules. Well, he kind of held a grudge about this and started to distance himself from the GRBC and basically I think anything he couldn't control, he didn't like. So then there is what should have been a very minor dispute over organizational structure. Actually had to do with who's going to be president of Baptist Missions, which all my family's in BMM, so I find that kind of funny. But there should have been this very minor dispute about exactly how we're going to structure things between Norris and Ketchum. Well, Norris blew it, I think, out of proportion, and he took the opportunity to attack Ketchum. After repeated, increasingly heated back and forth, at this point over letters, Ketchum acknowledged that Norris had a considerably larger platform than him and could crucify him if he wanted to. He says this, "All I desire to say is go ahead, dear brother, and crucify. Do a good, thorough job of it, and when you are all through, I will trust the God of resurrection to take care of his servant." So he's like, if you want to fight, go for it. We'll leave it in God's hands. Norris took him up on that, and sure enough, he began to attack Ketchum in his publications. He said a lot of things. Ironically, he attacked the GRBC as being a one-man show, which is kind of his whole bit as being a one-man show. And he cast Ketchum as that one man. And remember, that was Ketchum's worst fear, right? Is that the GRBC would be perceived that way. So that kind of hit home to him. It was kind of a deep cut. And so because of that, he actually rearranged the whole structure of the GRBC. So I alluded to the fact that Ketchum was the second and last president of the GRBC. The GRBC currently does not have a president. This is because this is what Norris proposed at the next convention, or the next association meeting. He proposed they abolish the presidency and the vice presidency, and instead the executive role of the GRBC would be carried out by a council of 14. Now it's 18. So it would be this council that would be nominated directly by the messengers and not by a committee. So the idea is the church would pick out, at the time, 14 men, and they would be the executors of the association. They would have the formal leadership, so it would not be tied up into one man. When proposing this, Ketchum said, There has been widespread criticism that this organization is a one-man outfit. While this is not true and could not be true, if the constitution of the association is changed to eliminate the lifting up of one man to the headship of the organization as president, and instead provides for the establishment of a properly elected council of 14 men, independently nominated by the individual churches, then the public will begin to realize what we have long contended, namely that there are no big men in the General Association, but only little men with a big God. And that really was Ketchum's heart in this. He wanted little men with a big God. That was his approach to ministry. So the GRBC accepts Ketchum's proposal. They did, however, ask Ketchum to stay on as a new role they invented called the national representative. So on a state level, we all know Brother Tim Capon. He is the state representative, all right? But Brother Capon has no executive authority over the IRBC. He has, I'm sure, influence because of his role, but he has no official authority. He helps organize events and things like that, but he fills pulpits and helps, promote the association and do things like that. But he doesn't make any decisions on behalf of the association. Instead, this is done by a council of men. And that's how the GRBC is structured. There's a council, and then there's a representative who kind of promotes the association and does certain things, but he has no actual authority. So there's like a figurehead, and there's also like the vested power, division of power, that sort of thing. I do find it, this is a bit of a dig, maybe. Garbic, I should say it right, GRBC churches tend to be suspicious of plurality of elders, but they insist upon that on the national level, which I think is interesting. They don't want a singular leader. They want a council of men, which I think is a fantastic idea and should also be done at a local church level. Okay, so all this is going on in response to Norris's attack on Ketchum. This restructure of the GRBC did not, of course, stop the attack from Ketchum. He would regularly attack Ketchum and anyone associated with him in his publication. And this is when Ketchum seems to start getting angry, is when he starts going after his friends. Ketchum starts getting frustrated at that point. He wrote many just demonstrably false things about Ketchum. He would send nasty letters to him. And it was like very junior high level stuff, like making fun of his appearance and, like mentioning a mutual friend and implying that we're both laughing about how pathetic you are, trying to like pit him against his own friends and stuff. It was just very, very nasty stuff. He would send him telegrams, like these kind of nasty telegrams, and time them so they would reach him as he was about to go up to preach on Sunday. He's just trying to get in his head, just really mess with him. Yeah. Norris was a fighter, and when he fought hard. The deacons of Ketchum's church offered to use all the church's resources to sue Norris for libel. Ketchum refused the offer, said we're not going to do that. Ketchum's son-in-law was a missionary, I believe, to Brazil. His daughter became very ill while overseas, like really, really sick, and had to come back to the States. Norris then attacked his daughter as being a weak coward running from the mission field. Like she's faking it because she can't handle the mission field. And that's not set well with Norris. I mean, imagine your daughter, okay? All this leads to, in Ketchum's own heart and mind, to an incident in 1939. And I'm just going to read something. This is from a letter he wrote to a friend, because I think his own words describe it best. He says, one day in 1939, I walked into my daughter's sick room in Gary, Indiana. And as I saw her frail little body lying on the bed, where it had been for many months, I asked her if she would like to sit up in a big overstuffed chair. She nodded her assent. I picked her up, set her in the chair, and turned to the bed for a pillow. When I turned back, she was in a heap on the floor. As I picked her up and laid her back in her bed and saw her flutter between life and death, a flurry of hatred swept through my soul for the man who had slandered her in his paper. As I realized what was taking place, I became terribly frightened. I called Mrs. Ketchum to take care of Lois and locked myself in a room alone. Kneeling down, I told the Lord that I would not and could not leave the room until I could pray in love for Dr. Norris. For over an hour, the battle raged. At last, in sheer exhaustion, I slumped to the floor and said, "Dear Lord, I can't." It was then that the dear Lord said to me, "Son, that is what I've been waiting for you to say. I know you can't, but I can. And if you want me to, I will do it through you." Before I knew what had happened, I was pouring out my soul in prayer for Dr. Norris. Both my wife and I have prayed for him literally hundreds of times since. There is no bitterness or hatred. There's absolutely nothing personal in any of these issues. that was settled, thank God, that day. Okay, so that's, and I actually get emotional reading that. So that's what's going on in Ketchum's heart and mind. What's up with Norris? What's going on with him during this time? Bowder and Delnay describe this about Norris as we're now moving into, let's say, the 40s. Bowder and Delnay say, power changes some people, and within his small circle, J. Frank Norris held nearly absolute power. His personal magnetism could sway crowds of adoring followers, and it was rare for his admirers to challenge him. If they did, he was capable of ruining nearly anyone, just as he tried to ruin Ketchum. It is difficult to say exactly when Norris understood the extent of his power that he held over people, or the degree to which he'd get away with lies and outrageous actions. But by the 1940s, however, he was clearly transgressing the boundaries of public decency, let alone biblical morality. Okay, so here's what's going on. Remember, ostensibly, Norris is pastoring 2 churches, one in Texas, one in Michigan. Of course, he can't be there to do any of the grunt work, so he has 2 lieutenants who are functionally doing everything in these churches, and he shows up to preach and get the applause, right? Those men are Ralph Jackson, I believe he's in Texas, and G. Beauchamp Vick is in Michigan. So these are the guys doing the actual work, okay? And they're very close to him, they're very trusted. But by the 1940s, there starts to be a rift between these 3 men. Jackson's wife, Dorothy, accused Norris of trying to initiate inappropriate interactions. We'll spare the details, but it was bad. And Dorothy was able to produce multiple pieces of collaborating evidence. So it was not just a he said, she said situation. There was pretty credible evidence this was a thing going on. Vic, he's the guy in Michigan, he begins to investigate, and he finds more evidence of impropriety as well as mismanagement. So that was kind of like the thought that triggered something in his head, like, oh, I should look into this. And sure enough, he starts digging, and there's more of this. Again, Bowder Delnay on this situation, they say Dorothy Jackson's accusations are at least credible. At the very minimum, Norris was indiscreet in his conduct towards women. More likely, as he learned the true extent of his power over others, he engaged in repeated sexual harassment. Okay, so that's going on kind of behind the scenes at this point. Meanwhile, Norris is getting older, and he would like to retire, but he doesn't really want to give up power. You know, he's trying to figure out how to make that work. So what he does is, he appointed his son George to be the puppet pastor of First Baptist Church, without permission from the church or George. So he literally just announces one day, George is now the pastor, and everyone in the room, including George, like, what? What's happening? You know, and the idea was George will just do what I tell him to, and I can relax on a beach somewhere, but still be in charge of this whole thing. Well, that lasted for about a year, and then his son kind of revolted against that. And it's like, no, I'm not going to do this anymore. There's a major rift between him and his son. Norris threatened his son's friends with criminal charges. He called his son a fool and offered to pay for him to legally change his last name. So, fantastic. This led to a church split at First Baptist. The biggest church in America has a split between father and son, and they go their separate ways. Meanwhile, J.B. Vick is the functional pastor of Temple Baptist in Detroit. Again, Norris shows up to preach. Vick is doing all the actual work. And Vic is the one who's starting to do this digging and realizing there's money just kind of disappearing here and suddenly ends up in Norris's bank account. And when he confronts about this, Norris says, nope, it's fine because, I am the church. And that's not how that works. He's also finding more and more women who are telling him things about his misconduct. So it comes to a head. Vic calls for Norris to explain himself to the Temple Baptist elders. And what he did, Vic, he obviously different than Norris, he did pick up on a bit of his showmanship. When Norris comes in to the boardroom, seated outside the boardroom is a woman whom he tried to have inappropriate relations with. And that was Vic's way of signaling, like, hey, you confess or I have evidence. Like, you tell him or I tell him. And that's what happened. Norris ends up storming out of the room. The deacons voted 25-1 to remove him from the pastorate. And that one person, he abstained because he had a personal relationship with Norris. He didn't actually vote to defend him. So then they bring it before the whole church. This is the church in Michigan. Remember, the church in Texas is already split. There was a vote to keep or retain Norris. The vote was done by standing, like all in favor stand. So it's a little hard to get exact numbers. What we do know is this. There were 3,000, roughly, people in attendance. It was much easier to count who was sitting. There were 7 of them. So 3,000, 7 people voted to keep Norris as their pastor. So you have the biggest megachurch pastor at that point in American history. He's been top since, but at that point in American history, and the whole thing crumbles at the end of his life. So God does vindicate his servants. Okay. Side note, J. Beauchamp Vick, after all that falls apart, he's like, now what do I do with my life? Anyone heard of Bible Baptist Fellowship, that association? He goes on to found that. Okay, so that's where that comes from. So, summarizing all this, is there some takeaways for us? I think in Ketchum and Norris, we see 2 radically different approaches to leadership and ministry. One is built on humility, both humility before God. We trust God to work. God does not need us. God does not need great men. He needs little men who will submit to him because he's a great God. He can handle it. And also humility for others based on cooperation with other people. Let's give other people opportunity and authority and influence. The other was built on personal magnetism and authoritarianism. These are 2 very different approaches. Norris's great man approach would pave the way for many of the problems we see in the American church. Both conservative, contemporary, liberal, all of them have been affected by this. But in Ketchum, we see an alternative, a ministry built on dependence on a great God, a humility in leadership, and a willingness to empower others. And we see in these 2 stories that wisdom is vindicated by her children. It's not always clear who's in the right in the heat of a conflict, but you give things enough time, it becomes evident. I think it definitely is true with Ketchum and Norris. Ketchum, his children, by the way, all followed God and honored their father. Most of Norris's kids rejected him as they grew older. The ministry that Ketchum built lasted for generations. Norris's institutions were held together solely by his personality. And when he crumbled, so did they. And that's the difference between those 2 men and the 2 approaches. I don't know, that's a lot of detail, but I hope you find that encouraging, actually, that I do think given enough time, the good guys win, if we define winning correctly. And it becomes evident over time what is correct and what is not. Anyone have any thoughts or comments on that or any of the kind of principles been discussed here? Yes, Stephen? I think that's right. It's very difficult to be indulgent and flesh-driven in one area and not have it spill over into other areas. So I think you're right. We've seen that many times, right, where a person has this thing that seems off the wall over here, but then you start looking into it, there's more going on. Yeah, appreciate that. Yeah.
This doesn't have anything to do with particularly the principles that we find in this whole story, but I know the further you zoom out, the less you can see. As far as so like at the national level, it's hard for me to really see what the national rep does. And perhaps he has a legit role. I'm not suggesting he doesn't, but when you get down to the state level, I do know that I see it practically. Again, I'm not suggesting that this structure is like something we get out of the Bible directly, but Tim Capon has, I think, a really valid and beneficial ministry as kind of a pastor of the pastors, for one thing. That's not all. But and I think he's also instrumental in helping a lot of the churches. For example, when they don't have a pastor, not just filling the pulpit for them, that's typically not what he does. He does some of that, but just as far as helping them, helping them in their process of finding another pastor and things of that nature, things that a council can't do very well. As far as oversight in that way. So he's kind of a shepherd amongst the Iowa Association churches, and I think it's a valid role. Even though again, you might not be able to pull it right out of the scripture somewhere.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. I think it is built on biblical principles, though, and it's certainly a legitimate way to do it. And I agree, especially on the state level. I think works pretty well. To be honest, I know very little about the GRBC on the national level, so I don't know how that plays out. But I think in principle, it makes a lot of sense. And in divvying up those functions, I think it actually helps both. Good. All right. Well, it's time for us to close here. I will close the word of prayer, and then we can move to the next service. Our Father, we do thank you for great men today, and for truly great men. Not men who think they are great, but men who do what is right before you and who honor you with their lives, both past and present. And so we thank you for that and their example. I do pray, Lord, you would help us to walk in humility, that we would see you as right before you, trusting that you are a great God, and so it's okay to be little, because you are great and you will do the work that we cannot. So I pray that you would help us to learn from these examples and to walk in faith and humility before you, trusting you to vindicate and to bring about the results that you want to bring about through our ministry. So even today, Lord, as we seek to worship you, seek to honor you this morning, I pray you would accomplish that. We can act in faith that you will, because you are a great God, and you will use our little efforts to glorify you in some way. Please bless our morning. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.